Lesson 1-12, Living Daily in or Out of Fellowship with the Holy Spirit. In this lesson, we want to help believers to understand their continual interaction with the two natures and how that impacts their daily relationship with the Holy Spirit. The diagram depicts two paths. The upper path represents a believer who sees the Lord as his master, that is, the one who oversees and manages his life. The lower path leads into a spiritual desert. This lower path represents the believer who, either out of ignorance or choice, has not acknowledged the lordship of Christ over his life. Therefore, the Holy Spirit doesn't have the freedom to produce his fruit through their life as he would like to. Before salvation, we were unbelievers, bound to the sinful human nature, represented by the chain around the darkened tree. At the cross, we were delivered from the penalty of sin. At the moment of salvation, the believer is freed from the mastery of the sinful human nature and receives the Holy Spirit, who indwells the believer from that time forward. The lower wandering line represents the abnormal Christian life. If not discipled and instructed as how to follow the Holy Spirit, most believers find themselves here. The typical result is that the believer will at some specific time ignore or discount the leading of the Holy Spirit to manage his life and finds himself in a desert experience, never quite being able to gain victory over the pull of the sinful nature, represented by the dark, solid line. This believer forfeits God's intended, fruitful Christian life. Once the believer makes the lordship decision, then the normal Christian life is one of consistently abiding in fellowship with the Holy Spirit. The green solid line at the top represents the time in which the believer is in fellowship with the Holy Spirit, walking in the Spirit. The presence of the sinful nature in the spiritual believer is represented by the dashed line. Each dip in the line represents a period of time when the believer is living out of fellowship with the Holy Spirit. On one occasion, King David was out of fellowship for about 9 months. As soon as he confessed his sin, he was immediately restored into fellowship. Did David still suffer consequences? The acceptance of Christ's lordship over one's life is no guarantee of continual, unbroken spiritual fellowship. Abiding fellowship is conditional. At any time, the believer may allow his fellowship with the Holy Spirit to be disrupted and find himself walking in the flesh or submitted to the sinful nature. At any given moment, we are either submitted to the Holy Spirit or we are submitted to the sinful nature. We are either walking in the Spirit or walking in the flesh. When you're out of fellowship with the Holy Spirit, he is not free to produce his fruit. The life of the tree is not flowing through the branch when we are out of fellowship. Typically, the believer who has chosen to live in a spiritual desert is focused on behavior. That believer is living according to his own limited human understanding, trusting in his own capabilities, rather than trusting the Lord to determine what is best for him. As long as they feel they can handle things, these believers don't rely on God for direction. However, when they are not able to cope with circumstances, they typically will call out to the Lord for help. They see God as the divine 911. God, help me. Once they consider themselves capable of handling things, they usually begin again to neglect the Lord and resume walking according to their own understanding. While the believer is residing in the spiritual desert, the Holy Spirit is hindered from producing his fruit through that believer. God will often allow a crisis in the believer's life in order to convince the believer to admit his own incapability and acknowledge his lordship. At the reward ceremony of Christ, there will not be punishment of any kind. However, the believer will experience the loss of rewards that the Lord had desired to give him had the believer been willing to allow the Holy Spirit to direct his life.